Some people feel you shouldn't want what you haven't got, but they clearly haven't been on the lookout for any of the following items. These are 10 historic objects that everybody wants to find, but nobody currently can. The Ark of the Covenant is a chest purported to hold tablets containing the 10 Commandments, as written by God himself. That's about as holy can get, which might explain why it melted the faces of any Nazi who tried to open it. Unlike Indiana Jones, we have no idea where the Ark currently is. Historically, King Solomon stored it in a sacred place called the First Temple. In its heyday, this was considered the holiest place in all of Judaism. That is, until 587 BC, when King Nebuchadnezzar II led his Babylonian army into Jerusalem with intent to conquer. And conquer they did, overwhelming the city while destroying the First Temple in the process. That, as of now, is the last the world has seen of the Ark of the Covenant. We're not even sure if it survived the building's destruction. There's every chance it did, because even Nebuchadnezzar wouldn't trample on the literal word of God. There's also every chance it didn't, because perhaps Nebuchadnezzar simply didn't care. If the Ark and the Commandments inside are around today, nobody knows where. If anybody does know, they're not telling. Maybe Harrison Ford can get them to share. If a 600-year-old royal sword like the Hanjo Masamune simply vanished one day, wouldn't you want to see it again? Much of Japan does, but there's a chance it will never happen. The Hanjo Masamune was created in the early 1300s by Goro Nyodo Masamune, perhaps the greatest Japanese swordsmith of all time. It earned its Hanjo name in the 1500s when a warrior named Hanjo Shigenaga won a bloody battle and claimed the Masamune as his trophy. He bequeathed the sword to his leader, Tokugawa Ieyasu, who later became Japan's first shogun. The Hanjo Masamune stayed in the Tokugawa royal family until the end of World War II. After the war, the United States showed a decided lack of interest in preserving the heirlooms of ancient dynasties, especially the sharp and pointy kind. They ordered the Tokugawa family to hand over all weapons, including the Hanjo Masamune, out of concern that someone might use them against the Americans. That is where the known story of the Hanjo Masamune ends. Nobody knows what the US did to the sword. If they destroyed it, then that's the end. If some soldier held onto it, then it might still be out there. Perhaps one day, the sword's current owner will come forward. Anyone who's laid eyes on the Florentine diamond must have been blinded by its beauty. Purportedly the largest yellow gem on the planet, the Florentine diamond boasted a whopping 133 carats, nearly 5 times the 24-carat jewels today's rich people love to brag about. Such amateurs. The Florentine diamond was among the most prized possessions of the royal family of Austria-Hungary, the Habsburgs. Then World War I came around, and Austria-Hungary, to their detriment, lost badly. Thus, the Habsburg family found themselves out of a job. Before getting completely ransacked by the winning team, the Habsburgs entrusted their precious diamond to an Austrian lawyer named Bruno Steiner. His job was to help the Habsburgs sell the diamond and make their forced early retirement as comfortable as possible. This probably did not happen, as a 1924 news report states Steiner was actually charged with fraud. The courts acquitted him, but for all we know, he got away with something. That something may have been messing with the Florentine diamond. After all, nobody has seen the diamond since World War I. You'd think something that large and shimmering would stand out. Some rumors that Steiner recut the diamond into many smaller pieces and sold them separately may well be true. Until the truth comes out, we only know one thing for certain. Bruno Steiner would be an amazing name for a pro wrestler. Lots of incredible artwork from one of the greatest creative minds of all time, Michelangelo, exists to this day. The original version of one of his most curious pieces, however, did not, and we would love to know exactly what happened to it. The painting is called Leda and the Swan. In it, the Roman god Jupiter, or Greek god Zeus, your preference, indulges in his favorite activity, seducing mortal women. In this case, he got with the Spartan queen Leda, a union that led to the birth of the famed Helen of Troy. Oh, and Jupiter assumed the form of a swan while doing this, meaning a human warrior queen saw a swan and got so excited she bore him human children. Myths are weird, just run with them. The painting was as erotic as a woman mating with a bird could possibly be. Leda was completely nude and in full, embrace with the swan. This may explain why Michelangelo's original is lost to this day. It's highly possible that an offended party took matters into their own hands and had the painting destroyed. While some surviving copies do exist, that's not the same as feasting hungry eyes and squirming stomachs on the original. If we're wrong and the original copy is still out there, we'd love to see it, if only to further prove why nobody should ever trust a swan. Back in the early days of cinema, few movies ran over an hour. Unfortunately, the first film of that length is currently lost to the ages. In 1906, an Australian film called The Story of the Kelly Gang premiered. Taking over an hour to tell the story of Ned Kelly's infamous outlaw gang, it became a huge hit. But the flick's rousing success came at a price. Kelly Gang inspired a string of copycat crimes from people enthralled by a large-screen take on very real violence. One crazy example from the tiny town of Ballarat concerned 5 kids who robbed a photo studio and then, at gunpoint, forced a local school to dismiss a group of school kids. Meanwhile, the towns of Benalla and Wangaratta, which several members of the Kelly Gang call home, never got to see the film. Censors, led by the Victorian Chief Secretary, decided the town's connections to the outlaws were too great to risk townsfolk seeing their neighbors in such a glorified light. Perhaps due to this infamy, nobody bothered to preserve the film, and it withered away. Some parts of the film remain, good for around 15 minutes of choppy viewing, but not the entire story. There's a 2004 film starring Heath Ledger as Kelly, but with all due respect for the Joker, it simply isn't the same. Fabergé eggs are among the most gorgeous and uniquely decorated Easter eggs of all time. Sadly, many of them, designed for Russian royalty, are currently nowhere to be found. Crafted by the Fabergé Jewelry Company between 1885 and 1916, the 50 eggs were meant exclusively for the Romanov family, who ruled Russia at the time. Their exquisite patterns and shining colors showed the company at the peak of their artistic powers. The first 10 were made for Tsar Alexander III, while the remaining 40 were crafted 2 at a time. One went to the mother of the new Tsar, Nicholas II, and the other went to his wife. By 1916, however, nobody of Russian royalty possessed any Fabergé eggs. The Russian Revolution of 1916 saw Tsar Nicholas and most other Romanovs overthrown and executed. This meant that their possessions, including many of their prized Fabergé eggs, fell into enemy hands. Over 100 years later, they've not been recovered. They are likely scattered all over the world, as part of this private collection or that one. Perhaps one day the Easter Bunny will deliver them to the Smithsonian or some other famous museum, but today is not that day. Despite the morbid name, the royal casket doesn't contain any dead bodies. In fact, right now it doesn't contain anything, which is a shame because what was once in there was likely priceless beyond words. Prior to 1800, Poland was an independent nation, but it eventually found itself divided in pieces by regional armies and other such conquerors. Princess Izabela Czartoryska decided to commemorate her country's past with a royal casket filled with historical artifacts from previous rulers of Poland. Such artifacts included jewelry, artwork, crowns, and countless other priceless pieces of Polish history. The casket served its purpose until the beginning of World War II, when Nazis invaded the country. They seized the casket, and having no appreciation or respect for the history behind the artifacts, simply stole them to do what they wished. Unfortunately, we don't know what they did with the casket's contents, or if they even survived to this day. Maybe the Nazis destroyed them. Maybe the Allies did after winning the war. Either way, our chances of seeing the royal casket and the sheer history inside are currently nil. One of the most famous sets of hominid fossils of all time, the Homo erectus specimen Peking man, actually didn't last that long in the public eye. Peking man came to our modern world in 1923, after his bones were discovered by Chinese researchers in a cave near Beijing. At the time, Beijing was known as Peking, hence their newfound friend's name. Any discovery of a full to nearly full prehistoric specimen is cause for celebration, and the discovery of Peking man was no different. Unfortunately, his time in the limelight was brief. Just 18 years later, in 1941, Japan invaded China as part of their World War II activities. Around that time, Peking man disappeared, leading many to believe Japan stole the fossil away. Nobody knows for sure, however, because we've had no sign of Peking man since. Theories aplenty exist, however. Some feel Japan did take Peking man, but lost him to the United States after surrendering in 1945. If so, Peking man might be in a private collection somewhere, or possibly lost at sea during a failed transport to America. Others believe Peking man is still in China, though he's been reburied over the decades. For all we know, he currently rests under a parking lot somewhere. If so, hopefully one day we'll unearth him again, and hopefully we won't dub him Parking Lot Man. It's far less catchy. Nearly 2,000 years before anyone heard of Shakespeare, the Greek writer Sappho was considered the greatest poet of all time. Unfortunately, we don't have much evidence to that, except other ancient Greeks' opinions of her. That's because, while historians believe she wrote up to 10,000 lines of poetry, precious few fragments remain to this day. It appears that not everyone shared the Greeks' love of Sappho. Many of her written poems wound up in Egypt, used as materials when making mummies. The rest are currently scattered to history. However, in recent years, Sappho enthusiasts found reason to rejoice, as papyrologist Dirk Obink announced the discovery of papyri featuring 2 new-to-us Sappho poems, purchased by an antiques collector on the streets of Egypt. In one poem, Sappho speaks of her brothers, and in the other, she rhapsodizes about unrequited love. Love and family are common topics for poets, but in Sappho's hands they gained extra special meaning. Hopefully, finding 2 Sapphic poems will soon mean finding 24 more, or even 200 more. Poetry-loving market dwellers, get to hunting. The Bible's Gospels, according to Mark, Luke, Matthew, and John, were written in the 2nd century AD, at least 100 years after the death of Jesus. Or were they? It's highly possible that the Gospels were originally written in the 1st century, shortly after Jesus. That, especially if the text translates differently to what we know the Bible to be today, would be absolutely game-changing. After countless centuries of scholars theorizing that at least some of the Gospels originated in the 1st century, in 2012, researchers seem to have found some proof. They uncovered a mummy mask containing all sorts of documents, including a fragment of the Gospel of Mark. Claims of carbon dating revealed the Gospel fragment dated back to the 1st century. In 2018, the fragment was finally published, but it turned out the claims were false. The fragment was actually from the 2nd century, and possibly the 3rd. So to this day, no 1st century Gospels have been uncovered, but their existence remains a legitimate possibility. The question is, where?